Professor Richard Wolff drops by to talk about the relationship between disasters and economics. Check this out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, his other website, rdwolff with 2fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff with 2fs. And Professor Wolff, welcome back. So glad to have you with us. I'm wondering, what is the historic relationship between economic crises and political change? Was there an economic piece to the Russian Revolution, or the French Revolution, the rise of Hitler, the Civil War, World War I and II? I know the American Revolution was preceded in 1770 by a major economic crash that caused the British Parliament to give a huge tax break to the British East India Company. That was the Tax Act of 1773 that provoked the Boston Tea Party. What about the rest of these? And how predictable is that association? And how often do we ignore it when we look at history?
Well, I think the problem is that while it is true that economic crises typically are followed by political upheaval, it's not always the case. Maybe the way to put it is political upheaval is frequently previewed, if you like, by an economic crash. But if the economic crash happens at a time that isn't contextually ready for it, then it can rise and fall. I mean, the way to say it is, for example, the great crash of 1929. And what we're living through now is the closest we have to that. The great crash of 1929, global in its scope, completely transformed, for example, Germany from a relatively progressive liberal state to modern Nazism. So you couldn't have a more dramatic. And likewise, the same crash in the same period of time produced a dramatic shift to the left, the opposite direction, here in the United States, when the Republicans gave way to a middle-of-the-road Democrat, Roosevelt, and he, in turn, responded to pressure from below and became probably the most progressive president in American history. So you can see that the crisis has different consequences depending on the environment, the context, and the economic crisis can or cannot provoke serious political adjustments. It is, however, true, and there's lots of examples, that it is hard to imagine a very severe economic downturn having no political consequence. That would be a hard one to find. We really are easier historically in seeing that anything approaching the kind of severity we're now going through, passing without political turmoil, that's extremely unlikely. So if what you're wondering, Tom, is are we in for a political rough ride, I think the answer is virtually certain.
It seems to me, Professor Wolff, that the Republican Party and the conservatives, or perhaps more correctly, the billionaires who are behind the conservative movement, or at least so-called conservative movement, much like, in the 1930s, the billionaires who were behind Hitler. I just last year finished reading Fritz Tyson's book, I Funded Hitler. I Paid Hitler was the title of the book.
Right.
And it was just an amazing story about how over about a year-and-a-half long period, he was financing the rise of Hitler, thinking that Hitler was going to be the best thing that ever happened to German industry. I mean, he was a steel baron, right? And, and it wasn't until the mid-30s, I think 36, 37, thereabouts, that Tyson realized really deep down in his guts what a horrible thing he had done and had to basically flee. And it seems to me, and I'd love to get your take on this, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong or argue with me, that our generation of Fritz Tysons, the right-wing billionaires, the Mercers and the Kochs and the Adelsons and whatnot, who funded the rise of Donald Trump and the modern Republican Party, have not read that book, have not got that memo, but they have learned from that lesson of what happened in the United States in 1932 versus what happened in Germany in 1932. And so rather, because in 32, as Hoover was, and the whole Republican machine, and it was substantial, as you know, was going down in flames. It wasn't just Hoover who was discredited, so was Coolidge and Harding, although Coolidge was, gone by then. That they're not letting the Republicans be discredited outside of just Donald Trump. In fact, they're trying to portray Donald Trump as sort of an anomaly. And they're building this conservative infrastructure, much like Tyson did in 1932 in Germany, to pave the way for a more, quote, business-friendly future, which I interpret as fascism. And they're not going to make the mistake that the conservatives of the 1920s did here in the United States. They're trying to play out the game plan of the conservatives in Germany in the early 1930s, or am I just have I gone way too paranoid and off the edge here?
No. I think that your rendering of the history is really basically quite correct. I think there is a key difference in Germany. Unlike here in the United States, the business community, Thyssen, Krupp, all the other huge backers, they initially didn't want Hitler. They initially wanted the conservatives to replace the left-of-center socialists, but the problem was history didn't wait for them. The socialists and then the Communist Party, which rose very fast in the 1920s, they zoomed into enormous power in the aftermath of the Great Crash. That's one of the lessons we ought to learn. From being strong, they became very strong, as millions of unemployed people had enough of capitalism and turned towards socialism, much as young people are polling in the United States today. So suddenly, the ruling groups, the big industrialists in Germany, were frightened. They were frightened that not only would they not get their conservative the way they hoped for, but they would be swamped by a working class split roughly between socialist and communist parties, and together wiping them out in terms of the capitalist dominance. In that panic, and this is all taking place in 1931 and 32, there's an election in which over half the people in Germany vote for either the socialist or communist parties, so that they are clearly on the rise. And in that moment, they turn to Hitler. They had made fun of him before, but he was the only one who had some sort of mass base that the conservative business community could turn to. Nobody else was available, so they went with him, and he quickly kind of turned the tables on them, leading people like Thyssen eventually to break away. We don't have that here. We don't have a strong left. Ironically, it is the right wing in America since the Great Depression, since the New Deal, that has done so much to wipe out the left. And here is the irony of the history. It was the left in the 1930s that got us Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, federal jobs program for millions. And that created the so-called middle class, a class that got higher wages than they could have gotten any other way with a strong union movement. This thing that the right wing is trying to destroy, it set up the American capitalism whose growth in the last 70 years after World War II, after the Great Depression is over, has been faster and more successful than ever before. The right wing is now destroying what might do it again, and therein lies the double irony that they're also self-destructive.